You think cancel culture is brutal. In 1326, medieval England didn't just cancel Hugh Despenser. They made his execution a 4-hour torture spectacle so horrific it makes Game of Thrones look tame. Imagine being dragged naked through streets while thousands, including children, cheer for your death. Imagine the queen you betrayed sitting on a platform above, sipping wine while you're disemboweled. This isn't fiction. We have the eyewitness accounts and court records. This is the story of how the king's corrupt favorite went from controlling an entire kingdom to having his body systematically destroyed in public. We're about to uncover how one man's depravity led to the most creative and disturbing execution in history, and why an entire nation called it justice. Picture this. It's 1316, and a minor knight named Hugh Despenser the Younger just got appointed royal chamberlain. Sounds boring, right? Wrong. This position made him the most powerful, unelected official in England. Imagine if one person controlled every email, text, and call to the president. That's basically what Hugh just achieved in medieval terms. This wasn't just an administrative position. It was absolute power disguised as paperwork. You probably think your boss's assistant has too much power when they control the meeting schedule. But Hugh? He controlled whether you lived or died based on whether your message reached the king. And here's the kicker. Edward II, the King of England, was so dependent on Hugh that he literally couldn't function without him. We're not talking about a helpful advisor here. We're talking about a puppet master who turned the entire English government into his personal playground. The appointment story itself reveals everything about medieval power games. Hugh wasn't chosen for his military prowess or diplomatic skills. He was chosen because he knew how to whisper the right words at the right time. Within weeks of becoming chamberlain, he restructured the entire royal household to funnel through him. Let me paint you a picture of a typical day in Edward II's court after Hugh took control. Morning. Hugh arrives at the king's chambers before dawn. There's already a pile of letters from nobles, bishops, and foreign ambassadors. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Hugh doesn't just sort these letters. He decides which ones the king will never see. That letter from the Earl of Lancaster complaining about tax policy. Into the fire. The message from the Bishop of Winchester about church corruption. Hugh will handle that personally. Thank you very much. By afternoon, there's a line of nobles waiting for audiences with the king. Some have travelled for weeks, spending fortunes to reach court. But Hugh controls the door. Lord Berkeley, one of England's most powerful barons, once waited 6 months for a meeting that lasted 5 minutes. Why? Because Hugh didn't like the way Berkeley looked at him during a previous encounter. That's not an exaggeration. The medieval chronicles specifically mention Hugh's vengeful memory for slights. Evening comes, and the king's council meets. Traditionally, this included the greatest nobles and churchmen in England. But by 1320, Hugh had engineered the removal of anyone who questioned him. The contemporary chronicler notes, the king's council became Despenser's echo chamber. The financial control was staggering. By 1322, Hugh and his father had redirected approximately 40% of royal revenue to their personal accounts. We're talking about £8,000 annually, enough to buy several castles or fund a small army. The Vita Edwardi Secundi records that no grant, no pardon, no appointment occurred without the Despenser's profit. Here's a specific example that shows how brazen this corruption was. In 1321, a merchant named William de la Pole sought a trading license for wool exports. The standard fee was 20 marks. Hugh demanded 500 marks plus 10% of all future profits. When William complained to the king, Hugh intercepted the complaint and had William imprisoned for disturbing the royal peace. William's family paid 1,000 marks for his release. That's medieval extortion at its finest. But the most disturbing part, the chroniclers report that Edward II knew exactly what was happening and didn't care. One account states, the king delighted in Despenser's harsh efficiency, calling him my dear and faithful Hugh, even as nobles wept at his cruelty. To understand how one man could gain this much power, you need to grasp medieval court structure. The royal chamberlain wasn't supposed to be powerful. He was meant to be a glorified scheduler. But Edward II had a fatal flaw. He desperately needed emotional support and was terrible at actual governing. Edward's personality made him the perfect mark for manipulation. Contemporary accounts describe him as more interested in rural pursuits than royal duties. Medieval speak for, this guy would rather be farming than ruling. He reportedly spent days ditching royal duties to dig ditches or thatch roofs with common labourers. Not exactly king material. Enter Hugh Despencer, who realised that by making himself indispensable to Edward's daily routine, he could effectively rule England. This wasn't unprecedented. Edward had a previous favourite, Piers Gaveston, who'd been murdered by angry barons in 1312. But where Gaveston was flashy and antagonistic, Hugh was calculating and systematic. The economic incentives for supporting Hugh's system were compelling. If you played along, you might get favourable treatment in legal disputes, tax breaks, or lucrative appointments. If you opposed him, well, you don't learn this in history classes, but medieval England had very creative ways of ruining your life without technically breaking the law. The barons who should have stopped this were paralysed by a catch-22. Opposing Hugh meant opposing the king, which was treason. But supporting Hugh meant enabling a system that was destroying the kingdom's traditional power structures. Many chose a third option, waiting and hoping something would change. Today's executive assistants might control calendars, but imagine if they could imprison you for complaining about a meeting time. Modern gatekeepers might be annoying, but they can't confiscate your property because they don't like your face. Makes you appreciate transparent government and actual oversight committees, doesn't it? We complain about political corruption, but at least modern officials have to be subtle about it. Hugh Despencer treated the English treasury like his personal ATM and the justice system like his private revenge service. And the scariest part? This was all technically legal because he had the king's approval. But controlling access was just the beginning of Hugh's master plan. See, medieval power wasn't just about money or influence. It was about breaking your enemies so completely that they couldn't fight back. And Hugh had one enemy he wanted to destroy more than any other, Queen Isabella of France, the woman who should have been his greatest political ally. Because once Hugh had the king's ear, he decided to destroy the queen's entire life, and that decision would ultimately lead to one of the most spectacular revenges in medieval history. Here's where Hugh made his fatal mistake. He didn't just fight Queen Isabella politically, he took away everything that made her human. It's 1324, and Isabella of France has been Queen of England for 16 years. She's navigated court politics, produced heirs, and maintained the delicate alliance between England and France. Then Hugh Despencer decides she's a threat that needs to be eliminated, not killed but destroyed piece by piece. Imagine your spouse's best friend suddenly controls your bank accounts, reads your emails, and decides who you can talk to. Now multiply that by medieval royal power, and you start to understand Isabella's nightmare. This wasn't normal medieval politics. This was personal warfare disguised as administrative efficiency. You think divorce is messy now? Hugh Despencer set the benchmark for a messy divorce. He turned England's queen into a prisoner in her own kingdom. The contemporary chronicles describe it as stripping away her dignity like bark from a tree. But they missed the crucial point. Hugh wasn't just humiliating Isabella. He was creating his own executioner. Let's start with September 1324, the month Hugh Despencer effectively ended Isabella's life as queen. The excuse was England's conflict with France, but the execution was pure malice. In a single day, Hugh orchestrated the seizure of 28 estates belonging to Isabella, properties worth approximately £20,000 annually. To put that in perspective, that's more than most duchies generated in revenue. But here's the truly twisted part, the method of seizure. Royal clerks arrived at each property simultaneously at dawn, reading identical writs that declared the Queen's lands forfeit for the safety of the realm. Isabella's own household accounts record her response, "I am treated worse than a merchant's wife," for even they keep their dowries. The land seizure was just the opening move. Within a week, Hugh ordered the arrest of Isabella's French servants, 31 people seized in coordinated night raids. Her physician, a man who'd served her since childhood, was thrown into the Tower on charges of corresponding with enemies of England. No trial, no evidence presented. Just Hugh's word that these people posed a threat. The purge included Isabella's confessor, her children's tutors, even her laundresses. The Chronicle of London records, "The Queen wept openly in court, but none dared comfort her for fear of Despencer's wrath." One noblewoman who offered Isabella a handkerchief was later fined 100 marks for encouraging sedition. Hugh then targeted Isabella's children. the future of England's royal line. Prince John, age 8, was removed from his mother's household and given to Hugh's wife, Eleanor de Clare. Princess Eleanor, only 6, was moved to Despencer properties in Wales. Isabella was permitted one supervised visit per month, with Hugh's agents present to monitor conversations. The Scottish incident of 1325 reveals the depths of Hugh's campaign. Isabella was travelling to negotiate peace with Scotland, a legitimate royal duty, but Hugh withdrew her military escort just as she entered contested territory. She nearly fell into Scottish hands, saved only by local monks who sheltered her. Hugh's alleged comment when he heard of her narrow escape: one less problem to manage if the Scots had done their job. Here's the moment that shows how calculated this destruction was. Christmas 1324, traditionally a time when the royal family appeared together. Hugh arranged for Isabella to be seated not beside the king, but below the salt, the medieval equivalent of being moved to the kids' table. Foreign ambassadors reported their shock at seeing England's queen treated like a minor courtier. Isabella's correspondence from this period, preserved in French archives, reveals her deteriorating mental state. "I am a prisoner without walls, a queen without authority, a mother without children, a wife without a husband's protection." To understand the full horror of Isabella's situation, you need to grasp what queenship meant in medieval Europe. A queen's power derived from 3 sources: her landed wealth, her household, and her role as mother to royal children. Hugh systematically attacked all 3. The land seizures weren't just financial, they were symbolic. In medieval law, land ownership equaled political voice. By taking Isabella's estates, Hugh essentially removed her from the political conversation. She couldn't reward supporters, maintain alliances, or exercise patronage. She became dependent on whatever allowance Hugh decided to grant her. The removal of French servants played into existing tensions. England and France were in constant conflict, and xenophobia was useful politically. But Isabella's servants weren't spies. They were her connection to her homeland, her childhood, her identity as a French princess. Hugh knew that isolating her emotionally would make her more vulnerable. The children's removal was perhaps the cruelest blow. Medieval queens derived enormous prestige from their maternal role. By controlling access to her children, Hugh controlled Isabella's future influence. Even if Edward II died, Hugh calculated, Isabella would have no power base to challenge him as regent. What made this campaign particularly effective was its legal veneer. Everything Hugh did had royal writs, proper documentation, official justification. He wasn't breaking laws, he was weaponizing them. The French chroniclers called it tyranny dressed in bureaucracy. Edward II's role remains debated by historians. Was he actively complicit or merely passive? Contemporary accounts suggest he was so dependent on Hugh that he genuinely believed these measures were necessary. One chronicler notes, "The king saw through Despencer's eyes and heard through Despencer's ears." Modern custody battles look civilized compared to this medieval destruction of a mother's rights. Today's financial abuse has legal remedies. Isabella had none. Imagine losing your kids not because you're unfit, but because your spouse's friend doesn't like your accent. That's essentially what happened to England's queen. We recognize coercive control as abuse now. In medieval England, it was just politics. Hugh Despencer pioneered techniques that modern psychologists would classify as systematic emotional torture. Isolation, financial control, maternal alienation. He wrote the playbook for destroying someone without laying a finger on them. But here's what Hugh didn't understand about backing a French princess into a corner. Isabella wasn't just any noblewoman. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, the king who destroyed the Knights Templar. She had iron in her blood and revenge in her DNA. Taking her children was the moment Isabella decided Hugh had to die. Not just die, be obliterated so completely that England would never forget what happened to those who pushed a queen too far. But before she could get revenge, Hugh managed to make himself even more enemies. Because apparently destroying the queen wasn't enough, Hugh decided to become a pirate. Yes, you heard that right. A pirate. Now here's the absolutely insane part. When Hugh was briefly exiled in 1321, this royal favourite literally became a pirate attacking English ships. Context matters here. In 1321, a coalition of barons finally forced Edward II to exile the Despensers. Most exiled nobles went to France or Italy to wait out political storms. Hugh? He got a ship and started robbing merchants in the English Channel. This wasn't desperation. It was a massive middle finger to the entire kingdom. The king's right-hand man trading silk robes for a pirate ship? Imagine if a fired White House chief of staff started robbing cargo ships off the coast of Virginia. That's the level of audacity we're talking about here. The Chronicle of Lanercost records the shocked reaction. Despenser, who once judged others for theft, became the greatest thief on the narrow seas. But Hugh wasn't just stealing. He was building a criminal empire that would fund his return to power. This wasn't desperation. It was a business model wrapped in vengeance. The numbers are staggering. In just 3 months of exile, Hugh's pirate fleet captured 16 merchant vessels. We're not talking about fishing boats. These were major trading ships carrying wool, wine, and silver. The total haul? Approximately £60,000 worth of goods, more than most nobles saw in a lifetime. But here's where it gets absolutely bonkers. Hugh kept detailed records of his piracy. Medieval pirates usually didn't do paperwork, but Hugh treated this like a legitimate business venture. The captured documents list specific cargoes: 2,000 sacks of wool from Southampton, 500 tons of Gascon wine, Flemish cloth worth 8,000 marks, and enough Spanish silver to mint coins. The merchant testimonies paint a picture of surreal encounters. Robert de Stretton, whose ship was taken near Dover, testified, "Lord Despenser appeared on deck wearing his court clothes beneath a mailcoat, commanding pirates as if conducting a council meeting." Another merchant reported that Hugh personally inspected cargo manifests with the same attention he once gave royal documents. The Cinque Ports bore the brunt of Hugh's maritime terrorism. These 5 ports, Dover, Sandwich, Romney, Hythe, and Hastings, were England's naval backbone. Hugh didn't just raid ships leaving these ports, he attacked the ports themselves. The raid on Sandwich in November 1321 saw Despenser's men burn warehouses belonging to his political enemies while carefully avoiding those of potential allies. Here's the detail that shows Hugh's tactical genius. He used intelligence from his court days to target specific ships. He knew shipping schedules, cargo values, and which merchants had opposed him. This wasn't random piracy. It was a calculated campaign of economic warfare. The international incident that nearly started a war. Hugh's fleet attacked 2 Genoese vessels carrying luxury goods to London. Genoa threatened to ban English merchants from the Mediterranean. French diplomats sent furious letters to Edward II about "your favorite turned sea criminal who attacks ships under royal protection." But the most insane part? Hugh recruited a pirate navy of over 200 men, including dispossessed knights, professional sailors, and career criminals. He established bases on the Channel Islands, created supply chains for stolen goods, and even issued his own form of safe passage documents. Ships that paid him tribute could sail unmolested. He'd created a parallel maritime government. The Bishop of Exeter wrote, "Despenser rules the waves more effectively as a pirate than he ever ruled the land as Chamberlain." Medieval piracy operated differently than Hollywood depicts. It was often state-sanctioned through letters of marque, making the line between pirate and privateer blurry. But Hugh operated without any legal cover. He was a straight-up criminal. The English Channel in 1321 was the Amazon shipping route of medieval Europe. Everything flowed through it. Wool to Flanders, wine from Gascony, goods from the Mediterranean. By controlling even a portion of these waters, Hugh could generate massive wealth quickly. What made Hugh's piracy particularly effective was his insider knowledge. He knew which merchants had unsettled debts to the crown, which ships carried the most valuable cargo, and when naval patrols would be lightest. He turned bureaucratic knowledge into piratical advantage. The political dimension is crucial. Every ship Hugh robbed potentially belonged to someone who'd supported his exile. This was targeted economic revenge. The wool merchants who'd funded baronial opposition found their profits vanishing into Hugh's war chest. But why didn't Edward II stop him? Simple. The king was already working to recall Hugh from exile. Every pound Hugh stole was potentially a pound that could fund their return to power. Edward's navy received orders to patrol everywhere except where Hugh operated. The Channel Islands' role deserves mention. These islands occupied a legal grey zone, technically English but practically independent. Hugh exploited this ambiguity, creating what historians call the first organized crime syndicate in English waters. Medieval maritime law was also surprisingly complex. Ships taken in just war could be legally kept, but defining just war was flexible. Hugh claimed he was waging war against rebels and traitors to the crown, meaning anyone who'd supported his exile. Modern politicians might have offshore accounts, but they don't literally turn pirate when fired. Today's disgraced officials write memoirs or become lobbyists. They don't commandeer fleets and terrorize shipping lanes. Makes you appreciate the Coast Guard and international maritime law. Hugh Despenser treated the English Channel like his personal toll booth, extracting payment from anyone who wanted to conduct business. It's like if a fired cabinet member started robbing trucks on the interstate and calling it alternative governance. The sheer audacity still shocks historians. A royal advisor commanding pirates while still technically serving the crown. That's corruption evolved into something entirely different. Modern white-collar criminals look amateur compared to Hugh's transformation from bureaucrat to buccaneer. But the piracy was just practice for the systematic theft he'd commit once back in power. See, Hugh learned something important during his maritime crime spree. Direct theft was profitable, but legal theft was sustainable. Within months, Edward II recalled Hugh from exile, and the pirate admiral became royal chamberlain again. But now he had a war chest, a criminal network, and absolutely zero fear of consequences. The kingdom was about to experience theft on a scale that made piracy look quaint. Once Hugh returned to power, he didn't need pirate ships anymore. He had something better, the king's seal, and absolutely zero conscience. Hugh Despenser's return from exile in 1322 marked the beginning of the most audacious property theft scheme in medieval English history. In just 4 years, he stole more land than most noble families accumulated over centuries. This wasn't conquest through warfare. This was administrative theft on an industrial scale. Think about modern eminent domain controversies. Now imagine if one person could use government power to foreclose on half of California, and you start to understand the scope of Hugh's ambitions. Contemporary chronicles call it the Great Devouring, as if Hugh was consuming the kingdom piece by piece. You complain about property taxes and zoning laws. Let me tell you about medieval property theft, where the only law was Hugh's greed and the only appeal was to a king who co-signed every crime. What happened between 1322 and 1326 makes modern financial crimes look like pickpocketing. Let's start with a case that exemplifies Hugh's methods. Lady Barrett, a widow holding 3 prosperous manors in Leicestershire. In 1324, Hugh decided he wanted her lands. The legal pretext? She was accused of plotting against the king, a charge so vague it could mean anything from actual treason to complaining about taxes. Lady Barrett was arrested at dawn, dragged to the tower, and subjected to what the records delicately call sharp questioning. Torture wasn't technically legal for nobles, but Hugh had creative interpretations of legality. After 3 weeks of imprisonment in conditions that broke her reason, Lady Barrett signed documents transferring her estates to Hugh Despenser. The contemporary account states, the lady, once proud and strong, emerged from the tower aged beyond her years, her wits scattered like leaves. She died within 6 months of release. Hugh got her lands valued at £500 annually. The legal documentation was perfect, signed, sealed, witnessed, completely legitimate if you ignored the torture. The Gloucester inheritance theft shows Hugh operating at maximum shamelessness. When the Earl of Gloucester died without male heirs, his estates should have been divided among his sisters, including Eleanor de Clare, Hugh's own wife. But Hugh decided his wife deserved more than her legal share. He produced documents claiming the other sisters owed massive debts to the crown. These debts were fictional, but the documents had royal seals. When Elizabeth de Clare, one of the sisters, protested, Hugh had her new husband imprisoned on trumped-up charges. She signed over properties worth £3,000 annually to secure his release. The Welsh expansion revealed Hugh's ultimate ambition, creating a personal kingdom. Between 1322 and 1326, he acquired 41 castles and lordships in Wales and the Welsh Marches. He didn't conquer these. He stole them through legal manipulation, forged documents, and strategic imprisonment of owners. The pattern was consistent: accuse the owner of treason, rebellion, or debt, seize the property temporarily for the crown, never return it. use armed men to occupy the estates before legal challenges could be mounted. By 1326, Hugh controlled a continuous territory from Glamorgan to Pembroke, larger than many continental duchies. The numbers tell the story. Hugh's annual income rose from £500 in 1318 to over £12,000 by 1326. He displaced over 200 minor nobles, destroyed 300 documented families, and controlled more castles than any non-royal in English history. His own quote, recorded by a horrified clerk, "Wales is mine by right of superiority, for the weak must yield to the strong." Understanding Hugh's land grab requires grasping how medieval property law worked, or didn't work, when someone controlled the legal system. Land ownership was documented through charters, but charters could be forged. Legal disputes were settled in royal courts, but Hugh controlled access to those courts. The medieval legal system's vulnerability to royal influence was absolute. Judges served at the king's pleasure. Juries could be intimidated or bribed. Documents could be discovered proving ancient debts or treasonous connections. When the person orchestrating this had the king's complete trust, resistance was nearly impossible. Land equaled power in the feudal system. Every estate Hugh stole meant military resources, economic power, and political influence. He wasn't just getting rich, he was building a power base that rivaled the crown itself. The intimidation factor can't be overstated. When Lady Barrett was tortured into signing away her lands, every other landholder got the message: resist Hugh and face similar treatment. Many signed away properties rather than risk imprisonment and torture. The threat was often enough. Why couldn't nobles effectively resist? The baronial opposition that had exiled Hugh in 1321 was broken after the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322. The Earl of Lancaster, leader of the opposition, was executed. Other rebel barons were dead, exiled, or cowed. Hugh had learned from his exile. He systematically destroyed potential opposition before they could organize. The role of forged documents deserves emphasis. Medieval document verification was primitive. If a charter had the right seals and witnesses, courts accepted it. Hugh employed a team of skilled forgers who created ancient documents proving his claims to various properties. One historian estimated that 40% of Hugh's property claims rested on completely fictional documentation. Modern asset forfeiture looks quaint compared to Hugh's wholesale theft of entire counties. Today's corrupt officials at least pretend to follow legal procedures. Hugh just took what he wanted and created the paperwork later. Makes you appreciate property rights and independent courts. We worry about government overreach, but imagine if the president's best friend could just decide your house was his now, torture you into signing it over, and call it legal. That was Tuesday in Hugh Despenser's England. Modern kleptocrats take notes from Swiss bank accounts. Hugh wrote the original playbook. At least today's corruption requires sophisticated money laundering and offshore schemes. Hugh's method was refreshingly direct. Want something? Take it. Someone complains? Imprison them. Still complaining? Torture them. Dead people don't file appeals. But stealing from nobles was risky. They had armies, alliances, and long memories. Hugh's biggest mistake was thinking he could steal from an institution even more powerful and vindictive than the nobility, the church. 300 families destroyed, so one man could play medieval monopoly. But when Hugh started stealing from bishops and abbeys, he crossed a line that even medieval England wouldn't tolerate. Because the church didn't just have armies, it had something far more dangerous: the power to destroy your eternal soul. Now we need to talk about the elephant in the medieval room. Were Hugh and King Edward II actually lovers? Or was this the world's first weaponized gay panic? Let's address this directly. Medieval chroniclers accused Hugh and Edward of sodomy, the medieval term for same-sex relationships. But here's the thing. Medieval England didn't do subtle when destroying enemies. Sexual accusations were the nuclear option of character assassination. Think about modern political sex scandals. Now add medieval prejudices, religious fundamentalism, and the death penalty for homosexuality. This wasn't just gossip, it was justification for murder. The question isn't just whether Hugh and Edward were lovers, but why this accusation became central to Hugh's downfall. You need to understand. Medieval England weaponized sexuality like modern politics weaponizes social media. Truth mattered less than impact. Whether Hugh and Edward shared a bed or just shared power, Their enemies made sure everyone pictured the former. This wasn't about outing anyone, it was about creating disgust so intense it justified extreme violence. The evidence starts with precedent. Edward II had a previous favourite, Piers Gaveston, killed by barons in 1312. The accusations against Gaveston and Edward were identical: excessive affection, private meetings, sharing beds, exchanging clothes. The Vita Edwardi Secundi states, "The king loved Gaveston beyond measure, as Jonathan loved David." When Hugh rose to similar prominence, the same accusations surfaced. But let's examine what contemporaries actually observed versus what they inferred. The Chronicle of Lanercost notes, "The king and Hugh were inseparable, conducting business in private chambers, emerging only for meals. Suspicious? Maybe. Proof of sexuality? Hardly." The gift-giving does raise eyebrows. Edward gave Hugh over 50 properties, countless jewels, and positions of power, but medieval kingship operated on gift exchange. Edward gave similar gifts to other favourites who weren't accused of being his lovers. The difference was that Hugh accumulated more because he lasted longer. The most specific accusation comes from Bishop Alton in 1334, 8 years after Hugh's death. The king abandoned his wife's bed for the company of Hugh Despenser, indulging in sodomy condemned by God. But note the timing. Alton made this claim when it was politically safe, not when Hugh was alive to dispute it. The joint signatures on documents were unprecedented. Usually kings signed alone. Edward and Hugh signed together on over 200 documents. Contemporary clerks found this disturbing, as if they were one person in two bodies. But was this sexual intimacy or political codependence? The counter-evidence matters too. Hugh was married to Eleanor de Clare and had multiple children. He showed no recorded interest in men besides Edward. His wife never complained about abandonment. In fact, she actively participated in his schemes. If Hugh was gay, he maintained an impressive heterosexual facade. But here's what's telling. The accusations intensified as Hugh's power grew. When he was a minor courtier, nobody questioned his sexuality. When he controlled the kingdom, suddenly everyone knew he was sodomizing the king. The correlation between power and sexual accusation is too consistent to be coincidental. The propaganda campaign was sophisticated. Poems circulated describing Hugh and Edward in explicitly sexual terms. Anonymous letters to foreign courts claimed England was ruled by sodomy. Sermons preached about unnatural vice in high places without naming names, plausible deniability with maximum impact. Medieval concepts of sodomy encompassed more than homosexuality. It included any non-procreative sex, heresy, and political disorder. Accusing someone of sodomy wasn't just about sexuality, it was about cosmic disruption. Sodomites didn't just sin personally, they threatened the natural order. The strategic value of sexual rumors was immense. Medieval society believed sodomy caused natural disasters, military defeats, and divine punishment. By linking Hugh to sodomy, his enemies made him responsible for every negative event in England. Bad harvest? Hugh's sodomy angered God. Lost battle? Divine punishment for tolerating sodomites. The political weapon aspect can't be overstated. In medieval law, sodomy was punishable by burning, but more importantly, it justified rebellion. If the king was committing sodomy, nobles had a duty to intervene. The accusation transformed treason into religious obligation. Modern historians remain divided. Some see genuine romantic, sexual relationships between Edward and his favourites. Others view these as intense political partnerships, sexualized by enemies. The evidence doesn't definitively prove either interpretation. What we can say, Edward II formed unusually intense attachments to male favourites. These relationships excluded others from power. Whether they included physical intimacy is unknowable, but the political intimacy was undeniable and threatening to established power structures. The gendered nature of medieval power made these relationships suspicious. Kings were supposed to be martial, dominant, producing heirs. Edward preferred craftsmen to knights, negotiation to warfare, and spent more time with favourites than producing royal children. In medieval terms, he failed at performing kingship. Hugh exploited this dynamic. By making himself indispensable to a king who desperately needed emotional support, he gained unprecedented power. Whether that relationship included sex matters less than its political implications. Today's political sex scandals end careers. Medieval ones ended with body parts on spikes. Modern society debates marriage equality, while medieval England debated whether accused sodomites deserved quick deaths or slow ones. Progress, however imperfect, is real. We've weaponized social media for character assassination, but at least we don't use sexual orientation as legal justification for public torture. Medieval England made homosexuality not just a sin, but a cosmic crime, requiring spectacular punishment, makes modern prejudices look almost quaint. The truth about Hugh and Edward's relationship died with them. What survived was the propaganda, the hatred, and the convenient excuse for extreme violence. Whether they were lovers, friends, or just political allies, their enemies made sure history would remember them as sexual deviants who deserved destruction. Speaking of that destruction, let's talk about how medieval England turned death into performance art. Because Hugh's execution wasn't just about killing a hated enemy, it was about creating a spectacle so horrifying that no one would ever forget what happens when you push a kingdom too far. The 4-hour torture festival that followed makes Game of Thrones look like children's television. On November 24th, 1326, the city of Hereford hosted medieval England's most elaborate execution, a 4-hour torture spectacle that made regular hangings look merciful. Dawn broke over Hereford to reveal something unprecedented, a 3-story viewing platform built specifically for optimal sightlines of the execution ground. Thousands had travelled for days to witness this event. Queen Isabella sat in a specially constructed royal box, wine and food laid out like she was attending a tournament rather than a torture session. This wasn't just an execution, it was medieval England's Super Bowl of vengeance. Street vendors sold food and commemorative items. Musicians warmed up the crowd. Wealthy merchants paid premium prices for platform spots. Parents brought children to witness justice being served. You think social media pylons are bad? This was analog destruction at its most creative. Every element was choreographed for maximum humiliation and pain. The contemporary Chronicle of Lanercost called it a death designed by demons for the education of mortals. The crowd didn't just want Hugh dead. They wanted him obliterated in ways that would echo through nightmares for generations. And medieval England's execution experts were about to deliver exactly that. The preparation began at dawn with ritual humiliation. Hugh was dragged from his cell naked, not even allowed a prisoner's shift. But nudity wasn't enough. They shaved his entire body, including his head and beard, so that no part of him retained dignity. Contemporary accounts note the crowd's delight at seeing the powerful Chamberlain reduced to a plucked chicken. Next came the painting. Biblical verses about betrayal and sodomy were written on his skin in ink mixed with pig's blood. The crowd could read Judas across his forehead, sodomite down his spine. This wasn't random graffiti. Each word was carefully chosen for maximum theological impact. The nettle crown deserves special mention. This wasn't just mockery of Christ's crown of thorns. Nettles cause excruciating skin reactions. Hugh's scalp immediately began swelling and blistering. The botanist executioners had selected the most venomous varieties, ensuring constant agony before the real torture began. The dragging route was precisely planned. Hugh was tied to horses backwards, facing the animals' tails, a special humiliation reserved for traitors. The route wound through market streets where merchants threw rotten produce, past churches where priests read condemnations, through neighborhoods where Hugh had evicted families. Every yard was lined with victims of his crimes. The scaffold itself was an architectural marvel of cruelty, 3 stories high, with pulleys and platforms allowing the executioners to display Hugh at various heights. The crowd could see everything. Musicians played between torture sessions, creating a rhythm of agony and anticipation. The execution sequence followed legal protocol, but with creative elaborations. First, partial hanging. Hugh was raised by the neck, but carefully, the executioners counted breaths, lowering him at precisely 40 to prevent death. The crowd counted along, cheering when he was revived with vinegar-soaked cloths. Next, the castration. But this wasn't quick. The executioner heated his blade in a brazier, ensuring cauterization to prevent bleeding out. Hugh's genitals were removed slowly, then burned in front of his eyes in a special iron basket. The chronicler notes, he watched his manhood become ash while the crowd celebrated. The disembowelment followed medieval tradition but with innovations. Rather than quick cuts, the executioner made precise incisions, extracting intestines slowly enough that Hugh remained conscious. His entrails were burned while still attached. He could feel the heat traveling up his body. Throughout this, a priest read charges between each torture: theft of royal lands, corruption of the king, sodomy, blasphemy, piracy, each charge punctuated by fresh agony. The crowd responded to each accusation with roars of approval. The beheading came as mercy after 4 hours, but even this was theatrical. It took 3 strikes, whether by design or incompetence. Hugh's head was displayed to the crowd, who pelted it with refuse before it was prepared for London Bridge. The quartering was public participation at its worst. The crowd voted on which body parts went to which cities. London got the head, York the right arm, Bristol the left, Hereford kept one leg, Northampton got the other. Democracy in action, medieval style. To understand this spectacle, you must grasp execution as political theatre in medieval society. This wasn't just killing, it was communication. Every element sent messages about power, justice, and social order. The torture sequence had symbolic meaning. Castration punished alleged sodomy and removed Hugh's ability to produce heirs. Disembowelment extracted the corruption from inside him. Beheading separated his evil counsel from his body. Quartering spread the lesson across the kingdom. Public participation was crucial. By throwing refuse, counting breaths, voting on body part distribution, the crowd became complicit. This wasn't Isabella's revenge alone. It was communal justice. Everyone shared responsibility and satisfaction. The medical reality was horrific. Medieval executioners understood anatomy well enough to maximize consciousness. They knew which cuts caused pain without immediate death, how to revive someone on the edge of unconsciousness, when organs could be removed without instant fatality. This was applied medical knowledge for torture. The religious dimension mattered enormously. Priests sanctified the torture by reading scripture between acts. This transformed execution from secular punishment into divine justice. Hugh wasn't just dying for crimes against England, he was being punished by God through human instruments. The economic aspect is often overlooked. Executions generated revenue through platform rentals, vendor licenses, and tourism. Hereford's economy boomed for weeks. Local craftsmen sold miniature gallows. Taverns created special ales. The commercialization of death reached new heights. Contemporary accounts vary in details but agree on duration and crowd size. Multiple chroniclers mention 4 hours, thousands of spectators, and Isabella's presence. The consistency suggests this wasn't exaggerated. Medieval England really did turn Hugh's death into a 4-hour festival. Modern executions hide behind prison walls with carefully selected witnesses. Medieval England sold tickets and encouraged audience participation. We debate whether lethal injection is cruel. They advertised cruelty as the main attraction. Makes you appreciate that justice and vengeance are now at least theoretically separate. Today, we worry about desensitizing people to violence through video games. Medieval parents brought kids to watch actual humans being systematically destroyed for educational purposes. See what happens to traitors, children, was considered good parenting. We argue about filming executions, about transparency versus dignity. Medieval England built 3-story platforms for optimal viewing angles and hired musicians for intermission entertainment. The regression from public spectacle to private procedure represents one of civilization's actual advances. But Hugh's death was just the beginning of the body horror. 4 hours of torture satisfied the crowd's bloodlust, but medieval England wasn't done with Hugh Despenser. His corpse was about to become the kingdom's most traveled political statement. Because in medieval justice, death wasn't the end, it was the beginning of your new career as a warning. Hugh's body parts would spend the next 4 years touring England, reminding everyone what happened to those who abused power. The logistics alone was staggering. You'd think 4 hours of public torture would be enough, but medieval England wasn't done with Hugh Despenser. His corpse was about to go on a grotesque tour of the kingdom. The executioner's final axe blow didn't end Hugh Despenser's public service to medieval England. In death, he was about to become more useful to his enemies than he'd ever been alive. His quartered corpse would spend the next 4 years as England's most travelled political billboard. Think modern Twitter harassment is persistent? Medieval England turned Hugh's actual body parts into permanent reminders of royal justice. Each quarter of his corpse became a regional warning, a decomposing declaration that abuse of power had consequences. This wasn't random vindictiveness. It was calculated political messaging using human remains as the medium. Every town that displayed a piece of Hugh reminded potential troublemakers that medieval justice didn't stop at death. Your corpse could have a longer career than your life. The logistics alone boggle the mind. Preserving, transporting, displaying, and guarding human body parts across a medieval kingdom required infrastructure, budgets, and dedicated staff. England literally created jobs around displaying Hugh's remains. The distribution began immediately after the quartering. Hugh's head started its journey to London Bridge that same day, carried in a special iron cage by royal messengers. The 130-mile trip took 5 days, with scheduled stops in major towns for public viewing. Worcester, Oxford, and Reading all got preview displays before the head reached its permanent home. London Bridge already hosted over 30 heads in various stages of decay, but Hugh's got premium placement. The bridgekeeper's records show he was paid extra to position Hugh's head, where all entering London must see it. The head was dipped in tar for preservation and placed in a specialized iron cage that prevented theft while allowing clear viewing. The limb distribution followed careful political logic. York received the right arm because northern barons had particularly suffered under Hugh's rule. The display instructions were specific: to be mounted at Micklegate Bar, at sufficient height that riders must see it, but low enough that features remain visible. Bristol got the left arm, displayed at the town's main gate. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Bristol was where Hugh had imprisoned numerous merchants during his piracy phase. Local records show merchants actually paid for platform improvements to better display their tormentors' remains. Hereford kept one leg, mounting it above the castle gate where Hugh had been executed. Northampton received the other leg, displayed at the Eleanor Cross, a monument to royal love now decorated with the remains of royal corruption. But the truly insane part was the maintenance required. Each display site employed guards to prevent theft. The body parts required regular tar reapplication to slow decomposition. Cities actually budgeted for dispenser display expenses. The public interaction with these remains shocks modern sensibilities. Children sang rhymes about Hugh's hand waving at York Gate. Merchants in Bristol used the displayed arm as a meeting point. See you at Dispenser's Arm after morning mass. The normalization of displayed human remains as civic landmarks reveals medieval England's different relationship with death. Eleanor de Clare's quest to retrieve her husband's remains began in 1330, after Edward III granted permission, but finding Hugh proved challenging. 4 years of weather and tar had transformed the body parts beyond easy recognition. She found a thigh bone in London after bribing the bridgekeeper, skull fragments in Bristol identified by dental work. York claimed dogs had stolen the arm. Hereford and Northampton provided leg bones that may or may not have been Hugh's. The medieval practice of displaying traitors' remains served multiple purposes beyond simple vengeance. Body parts functioned as primitive mass communication, broadcasting royal power to illiterate populations. Seeing Hugh's head on London Bridge told every visitor that royal justice reached everywhere. The religious implications were severe. Christian doctrine required bodily resurrection at Judgment Day. Scattered remains theoretically prevented this, adding eternal punishment to temporal execution. Hugh's dispersed quarters meant he couldn't rise whole at the second coming, a theological disaster worse than death. The economic ecosystem around displayed remained surprises modern observers. Cities competed for prestigious body parts that drew visitors. Taverns near display sites thrived. Artists sketched the remains for patrons who couldn't travel. Displaying Hugh's quarters literally boosted local economies. The preservation techniques reveal medieval practical knowledge. Tar prevented rot while maintaining recognizable features. Iron cages balanced security with visibility. Display heights were calculated for maximum impact without enabling vandalism. This wasn't primitive brutality, it was engineered intimidation. The psychological impact on viewers varied by class. Nobles saw warnings about overreach. Merchants remembered Hugh's piracy and property theft. Commoners enjoyed seeing elite power literally cut down to size. The same rotting arm meant different things to different viewers. The 4-year display period wasn't arbitrary. Medieval justice theory held that public memory lasted approximately 4 years without reinforcement. Hugh's remains stayed up exactly long enough to embed his fate in collective consciousness before allowing Christian burial. Eleanor's recovery mission shows how even medieval brutality had limits. After suitable public display, authorities allowed families to retrieve remains for proper burial. This balanced public justice with private mercy, demonstrating royal magnanimity while maintaining the threat. Modern justice ends at death. Medieval justice just got started. We debate displaying mugshots online while medieval England displayed actual heads on bridges. Today's public shaming campaigns last news cycles. Hugh's lasted 4 years and required maintenance budgets. We worry about dehumanizing criminals through media coverage. Medieval England literally dehumanized them, turning body parts into civic decorations. Makes you appreciate closed caskets and privacy laws. At least modern infamy doesn't require tar application and guard rotations. The idea of children using executed criminals' remains as meeting points should disturb us more than medieval people. We shield kids from movie violence while they played under real severed heads. The psychological distance between then and now cannot be overstated. But here's the darkest irony of all. The people who orchestrated Hugh's destruction, who cheered his quartering and displayed his remains, would soon face their own downfalls. Medieval justice was cyclical, and everyone who participated in destroying Hugh was about to learn that extreme violence creates its own momentum. The wheel of fortune that crushed Hugh Despenser was already turning for his destroyers. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer thought they'd won everything. They were about to discover that in medieval England, today's executioner was tomorrow's victim. The most disturbing part isn't Hugh's execution, it's what happened to everyone who participated in destroying him. Fast forward to November 29th, 1330, exactly 4 years after Hugh's execution. Roger Mortimer, the man who orchestrated Hugh's destruction, stands on his own scaffold at Tyburn. The crowd notices the date isn't coincidental. Medieval England loved its symbolic justice. Queen Isabella watches from a window as her lover faces the same fate she inflicted on Hugh. Her son, Edward III, arranged this viewing to remind his mother that royal justice cuts both ways. You think karma is just a social media concept? Medieval England turned it into political policy. The Chronicle of Westminster records the crowd's chants, "Despenser's ghost demands company." This wasn't just another execution, it was the universe balancing its books. Everyone who participated in Hugh's spectacular destruction was about to learn that medieval violence was a circle, not a line. Mortimer's execution eerily mirrored Hugh's in deliberate ways. He was dragged through London streets on the same type of hurdle, past jeering crowds who remembered him presiding over Hugh's torture. The chroniclers note, those who cheered Mortimer 4 years prior now pelted him with the same refuse. The execution itself followed Hugh's template with pointed variations. Mortimer was hanged and drawn but not quartered. Edward III showed mercy by allowing burial intact. But that mercy came with a twist. Mortimer's body was displayed at Tyburn for 3 days, the same duration Hugh's quarters decorated Hereford before distribution. Isabella's living death proved worse than execution. Edward III couldn't execute his mother, but he could destroy her systematically. Her imprisonment at Castle Rising came with cruel requirements. Yearly visits to Hereford on November 24th to pray for Hugh Despenser's soul. Imagine being forced to annually revisit the site where you orchestrated someone's torture. For 28 years, Isabella lived under house arrest. Her son assigned servants who reported every word. Her correspondence was monitored. Her annual income, once £20,000, was reduced to £3,000, comfortable but humiliating. She who had destroyed Hugh for taking her children now, lost her own son's love forever. The minor players faced equally grim fates. Judge William Trussell, who pronounced Hugh's death sentence with such enthusiasm, died mysteriously in 1332. His servant found him, purple-faced and tongue-swollen, classic signs of poisoning. No investigation followed. Edward III's justice operated through various channels. Of the 12 nobles who signed Hugh's death warrant, 6 died within 5 years under suspicious circumstances. Falls from horses, sudden illnesses, hunting accidents. Medieval England had many ways to balance accounts. The survivors lived in paranoia, hiring food tasters and avoiding public appearances. Bishop Orleton, who provided theological justification for Hugh's execution, faced heresy charges in 1334. The same sexual accusations he'd leveled against Hugh now targeted him. Though acquitted, the process destroyed his reputation and health. He died claiming Hugh's ghost tormented his dreams. The executioner who performed Hugh's torture was found dead in 1328, his body bearing ritualistic wounds matching those he'd inflicted. His workshop was burned, his tools melted down. Medieval justice didn't forget its instruments. The merchants who profited from Hugh's execution, selling food, renting platforms, faced economic destruction, tax audits, trade license revocations, mysterious fires. Edward III's agents ensured those who celebrated Hugh's death paid commercially. Medieval political cycles operated on predictable patterns. Extreme rises led to extreme falls. Those who destroyed predecessors violently created precedents for their own destructions. Hugh's spectacular execution normalized torture as political tool, making Mortimer's similar fate inevitable. The concept of divine justice permeated medieval thinking. Contemporary chroniclers interpreted the fates of Hugh's destroyers as God's judgment. The Polychronicon states, "Those who spilled blood unjustly found their own blood demanded." This wasn't seen as coincidence but cosmic balance. Edward III's calculated response deserves analysis. By punishing his mother's faction, he positioned himself as restoring legitimate royal authority. But he carefully calibrated punishments, enough to satisfy justice without creating new martyrs. Mortimer died, but wasn't quartered. Isabella suffered, but lived. The cycle of extreme violence was deliberately broken. The psychological impact on participants reveals medieval justice's true horror. Those who cheered Hugh's destruction spent years fearing similar fates. The temporary satisfaction of vengeance transformed into permanent paranoia. Every noble who signed Hugh's death warrant lived knowing they'd established precedents for their own potential executions. The legitimacy question haunted everyone. If Hugh deserved death for corrupting royal power, didn't Mortimer deserve the same for manipulating Isabella? If sexual deviance justified torture, why not apply it universally? The logic of extreme justice inevitably consumed its own advocates. Economic motivations matter here. Edward III needed stability after years of chaos. By selectively punishing Hugh's destroyers, he sent clear messages about royal authority while avoiding widespread purges. Medieval justice served political needs more than abstract principles. Modern political rivals might face trials or career destruction. Medieval ones faced identical tortures they'd inflicted on predecessors. Today's cancelled celebrities complain about lost opportunities. Medieval England's cancelled nobles lost body parts. Perspective matters. We worry about political polarization creating cycles of revenge. Medieval England literally institutionalized revenge cycles, with each faction's rise meaning the previous faction's torture. Makes modern peaceful transitions of power look miraculous by comparison. Cancel culture has nothing on medieval justice circles. At least Twitter mobs can't legally quarter you for past tweets. Medieval England made "what goes around comes around" into formal execution policy. Every torturer knew they might someday face their own methods. Isabella spent 28 years remembering the execution she orchestrated, forced to annually revisit her greatest triumph turned deepest shame. That's a level of psychological torture modern justice systems would consider cruel and unusual. Medieval England called it divine symmetry. Which brings us to the ultimate question about medieval justice. Was any of this actually justice, or just elaborately decorated vengeance? Hugh Despenser was undoubtedly corrupt, cruel, and deserving of punishment. But did his crimes justify 4 hours of public torture and 4 years of displayed body parts? Remember at the beginning when I promised to show you how one man went from controlling a kingdom to having his genitals burned in front of his eyes? Well, now you've seen every disturbing step of that journey. From Hugh Despenser's rise as the puppet master behind England's throne to his final moments as medieval England's most spectacular example of justice as entertainment. You've witnessed how a minor knight became so powerful he could steal from nobles, destroy a queen, and turn pirate when it suited him. You've seen how his relationship with Edward II, whether romantic or just politically intimate, became the weapon his enemies used to justify turning his execution into a 4-hour torture performance. And you've discovered how his body parts became political billboards, scattered across a kingdom that wanted to make sure no one ever forgot what happens when you push medieval power too far. But here's the ultimate irony. Everyone who orchestrated Hugh's destruction, from Roger Mortimer to Queen Isabella herself, eventually faced their own downfalls, as if medieval England was determined to prove that extreme violence only breeds more violence. Hugh Despenser's story reveals something disturbing about human nature that transcends centuries. When we get the chance to destroy someone we truly hate, we don't just want them dead, we want them obliterated. Medieval England didn't have Twitter mobs or cancel culture, but they had something arguably worse: the ability to turn vengeance into a public festival. The creativity they put into Hugh's execution, the symbolic punishments, the theatrical elements, the distribution of body parts like grotesque souvenirs, shows that our modern forms of public shaming are just sanitized versions of much older impulses. We've replaced physical torture with digital pylons, exchanged public executions for social media destruction, but the underlying desire to completely annihilate those who abuse power remains unchanged. The difference is that we've decided ruining someone's career is more civilized than burning their genitals in the town square, though I'm not sure Hugh Despenser would see much distinction between the two forms of social death. So the next time you complain about political corruption, toxic relationships, or social media harassment, just remember, at least you're not living in medieval England where your ex's best friend could legally steal your children, where disagreeing with the wrong person meant watching your intestines get pulled out, and where justice was a 4-hour torture show. Thank whatever deity you believe in that modern justice, flawed as it is, doesn't include nettle crowns and public castration. Be grateful that our worst politicians face impeachment, not impalement, and that body parts on city gates have been replaced by angry tweets. Medieval England makes our darkest moments look like minor inconveniences. If this disturbing dive into medieval justice blew your mind, hit subscribe for more hidden histories they definitely didn't teach in school. Drop a comment with which part shocked you most, Hugh's pirate phase or that 4-hour execution. And remember, in medieval England, not subscribing was probably punishable by something horrible.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.